We tend to find comfort in sameness, the same town, the same grass, the same creatures waiting for you on the other side. For nearly 3 decades, Pokemon has offered that comfort. Every few years, the series presents us with something new, whether that be a new region, a new generation, a new gimmick that promises to shake up the formula. But beneath that surface, the rhythm has remained constant. You wake up in a quiet town, you receive your first starter, you defeat gym leaders or their equivalent, confront some villainous team, catch some legendary Pokemon, become a champion. Critics have argued this on and off for a few years now that Pokemon as a franchise has stopped evolving, but that criticism is very surface level. It misses something important. The franchise doesn't change, not because it can't, but because it doesn't need to. Its lack of innovation, its bare minimum of keeping up with modern gaming standards, it's all by design, or at the very least, it isn't a concern for Game Freak or Nintendo or the Pokemon Company. The repetition is their whole business model, designed to pull you in and remain consistent yet fresh enough to justify creating a new game, with new Pokemon and new gimmicks. That sense of both sameness and freshness is powerful, and it sells. Not just to children discovering their first Pokemon, but to adults chasing a version of themselves that no longer exists, whether that's through the games or the ungodly amount of merchandise. For the companies, that nostalgia we feel is its own form of currency that accumulates interest as we grow up, that they can cash in when we're adults. For us, the audience, it's a loop that feels gratifying, even as it slowly dulls our expectations. The product itself barely matters. What matters is the feeling it provokes, the illusion of newness, the ritual of starting over, the promise that this time something has changed, but not much. Because nothing's really changed, and maybe at this point it's too late to expect that it ever will. No matter how much controversy it finds itself in, the Pokemon franchise keeps pushing on, seemingly immune to critique, with no one ever understanding the full story. Until now, because there's much more to the Pokemon Empire than just nostalgia. They have a system that allows them to keep churning out these games, spin-offs, anime, and merchandise, without ever hardly having to change. And to understand it, we first need to look at the release and criticism of their newest game. Legends ZA has had a bit of a controversy with its release, as is becoming typical for new releases among Pokemon, with some focusing on the gameplay being new and innovative, and others criticizing the company for having horrifically outdated graphics, performance, and lack of features compared to most modern games. Despite this criticism though, ZA has enjoyed pretty favorable reviews amongst critics, even while many fans continue to grow more and more disgruntled with the state of modern Pokemon. Why the Pokemon franchise enjoys these consistently favorable reviews, we should first look at the critics themselves. In modern gaming reviewing, access is its own form of currency. Reviewers don't truly operate independently. Their ability to cover a game is pretty much entirely up to the publisher, at least as far as publishing early impressions, attending launch events, interviewing developers is concerned. In other words, the press depends on the generosity of those it covers. Publishing an unflattering story or violating an unspoken expectation can lead to temporary or permanent exclusion from future access. Then you have the audience to consider. If you give a good review of a game everyone hates, or vice versa, they might turn on you in a pretty scary way. This has been described as a network of ambivalences, where critics are simultaneously journalists and participants that perpetuate the culture surrounding the industry that they critique, stuck between the expectations of publishers, consumers, and even the companies they themselves work for. Our little access currency takes many forms: advanced review copies, press kits with concept art or character bios, invitations to exclusive events, or early gameplay demos. Each of these is controlled in both distribution and timing. Publishers can choose whom to include, what assets to provide, and how much time critics have to prepare coverage. Why does this matter? Well, critic evaluations carry weight in consumer decision-making, and as its own form of marketing for the game. The film industry has shown that expert reviews influence audience behavior for experienced goods. Video games operate in a similar way, with critical praise showing value and legitimacy, increasing customer trust and sales. But because access is controlled by the publisher, the very mechanism that allows critics to influence audiences simultaneously creates an incentive to maintain favorable relationships with those publishers. This means that access shapes coverage, even when critics attempt to remain objective. It's technically not bribery or coercion, and it turns out, when you have enough money, you can get away with a lot of technicalities. However, access is strictly controlled by timing, which producers can control through embargoes. An embargo is a restriction on the publication of reviews, typically imposed in conjunction with the game's release date. This makes sense at first, since a coordinated release would be fair competition for all outlets, but in practice, embargoes have another purpose. They shorten the review cycle, forcing critics to assess a game within a limited time frame and reducing public scrutiny prior to release. Critics are then forced to attempt to provide good coverage while under pressure. When Nintendo imposes review embargoes on significant first-party releases that end just days before the game's release, which has happened with Scarlet and Violet and Tears of the Kingdom, technical problems that take time to notice, like balance issues or hidden bugs, will go unnoticed until launch when the game is in the hands of the public. Reviews will then inherently prioritize surface-level impressions and easily observable features over in-depth long-term analysis. In addition to these time constraints, the need to preserve professional access also encourages shallow analysis. A reviewer runs the risk of losing early access to upcoming titles, interviews, or exclusive events if their coverage is perceived as hostile, no matter how minor. We can look at specific instances where publishers used access to sway coverage. Duke Nukem Forever is one such instance. The game's public relations company openly threatened to stop producing review copies to publications that provide unfavorable reviews in the future. Journalists soon realized that refusing to comply could cost them invitations to events, early access to major titles, or even insider interviews, so this threat was not made in vain. In 2015, Kotaku was involved in another case where they openly revealed that it was partially blacklisted after publishing stories that upset certain publishers. In his first-person narrative, A Price of Games Journalism, Stephen Totilo describes how some publishers prevented review copies or invitations to events, which hindered the outlet's ability to report ahead of time. The very fact that this punitive system exists will change the behavior of critics. Critics need access to games early. They post reviews online. They make ad revenue off of the things that they post. If they aren't competitive in this space, then they don't make money, which gives them a financial incentive to play nice with the publishers. Both of these instances show that the leverage exists, albeit infrequently, but even isolated incidents can still have an effect on the entire ecosystem. Critics that use caution and careful wording and are selective about what they cover are encouraged to do so by the possible cost of losing access. This translates behaviorally into a number of patterns. When a reviewer is given early access, they frequently feel a social or professional duty to present the game in a favorable light. This isn't inherently bad because reporters know that maintaining these connections is important for getting access to high-profile releases and events, but this means that economic incentives are then butting heads with real journalism. Although negative reviews would encourage clicks, it also runs the risk of compromising collaboration and long-term access. This, along with nostalgia and the emotional attachment that critics experience just as people, will produce a pattern of behavior where leniency is psychologically and practically reinforced. This means then that critics and reviewers become predictable, with reviews that reward familiar or nostalgic elements and normalize technical flaws, all coalescing into something called the Nintendo exception, a phenomenon where shared nostalgia and critical leniency combine to create remarkably forgiving coverage of not just Pokémon, but other Nintendo games. Even when performance, graphics, or gameplay fall short of industry standards, Nintendo first-party games often receive higher critic averages than comparable third-party releases, like Legend ZA, for instance. For Nintendo and Pokémon games, critics give more room for errors, and more credit for small improvements and quote-unquote novelty, or what I like to call it, the Nintendo exception. Let's look at Metacritic. When Pokémon Scarlet and Violet were released in late 2022, there were reports of serious performance problems, including texture pop-ins and frame rate drops. That would have decimated the score of most AAA games. However, the game's average review score remained in the low 70s, which is on par with or better than technically better games that received worse reviews for less money. The user score, though, was significantly lower, with the audience being harsher than the critics. The earlier instances of Kotaku's blacklisting and Duke Nukem Forever show the harsh side of publisher retaliation. Journalists are under pressure, access is denied, and coverage is limited. And in contrast, Nintendo rarely has to use threats or punishment because the critical ecosystem's loyalty and reliance on them means there's no need for enforcement. This soft control is best seen with Nintendo's embargo policies, with embargoes lifting less than 24 hours before public release. Review copies for flagship releases, including Scarlet and Violet and Pokémon ZA, are only given out a few days prior to launch. Performance testing and in-depth analysis are not possible in this time frame. Critics are able to explain their initial thoughts, sure, but they don't have the time to examine deeper and more nuanced problems. As a result, there is an abundance of polished reviews that focus on things like scope and charm and heart, with technical problems being mentioned in passing or frequently forgiven. But critics, in this case, are being conditioned, not forced. When dependency itself serves the purpose, the system doesn't need to use overt threats to compel obedience. In order to keep access and professionalism, critics have to uphold their relationships. This sort of dual loyalty makes objectivity almost impossible. Even without embargoes and the access pressures and advertiser influence, Nintendo's critical insulation would still persist because the critics themselves are emotionally implicated via their own nostalgia. This ambivalence is both systemic and personal, since critics perform journalism in a medium that is inextricably linked to the development of their own identities, where they then act as both fans and evaluators. This creates a feedback loop between professional judgment and nostalgia, so when a new Pokémon game is released, the critic is revisiting a part of their childhood rather than just reviewing a product. Some might refer to the critic's nostalgia as affective priming, which is a type of cognitive bias. The harshness of their critique is moderated by the unconscious transference of positive emotional associations from childhood, i.e., nostalgia, which is then put to their critical reviews. In Pokémon, the same problems that would be offensive in a game from Ubisoft or Square Enix become a part of the brand itself. The rhetoric of reviews shows this. Even when discussing games with little innovation, terms like magical and heartfelt and comforting are commonly used in Nintendo coverage. Even as technical performance declined over generations, Pokémon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, Sword and Shield, Scarlet and Violet were all praised for their charm and nostalgia. Critics are blinded by this nostalgia, and even if they weren't, they still exist within a system where they are more or less coerced to give positive press to maintain access to games. When combined, this makes an almost ideal feedback system that protects Nintendo and Pokémon in particular, and allows them to stagnate without facing any repercussions. This is just the critic side of things, though. So if access that critics have, the bias for Nintendo, and the pressure on them explains why Pokémon is protected, critically speaking, the nostalgia explains why it doesn't need to change. One thing that the series is best known for is its formulaic repetition, rarely deviating far from the choose a starter, do the gyms, beat the bad guys, become the champion formula. But this isn't just a lack of creativity. This design decision was made to keep each successive generation of people within the same feeling of nostalgia, capitalizing on old fans and new fans alike, no matter when a game releases. Since it isn't intended to, this template hasn't changed in almost 30 years. With just enough novelty to feel new, each new release allows players to relive the same emotional arc by mirroring the structure of the previous one. Think of all those gimmicks that the games have had over the years. While usually fun, the core gameplay doesn't get affected nearly that much. And by having a new gimmick each time, they can always return to one to cash in on those who liked it the best, like with Mega Evolution. This is a commercial form of nostalgia. The Pokémon Company shapes players to associate familiarity with comfort and purchase reliability by reiterating the same story and core gameplay. Nostalgia actually increases positive affect, social connectedness, and trust in brands associated with their recollections. Every design decision made by Pokémon is intended to elicit specific emotions and nostalgia. But recontextualizing the past through nostalgia turns our memories into a form of emotional reinforcement. It reinterprets them as more meaningful, secure, and emotionally valuable, rather than just us merely recalling them. Nostalgia boosts consumers' trust in and propensity to buy from companies associated with early life, and decades of research have shown that nostalgic cues boost customer loyalty. When the emotions a brand evokes match the consumer's idealized self-concept, nostalgia produces something called affective congruence. What this means is the person is purchasing access to a version of their past, free from the disappointments of adulthood, rather than just purchasing a simple product. You get to relive your childhood. The product is being evaluated by the customer as an extension of themselves rather than as just an object. The secret to Pokemon's success is how it capitalizes off of this, with each iteration of the design and each recognizable rhythm creating a feeling of personal preservation. This makes sure that criticism feels not only superfluous, but also offensive by turning it into an attack on the brand to an attack on our childhoods and identities. For many people, rejecting Pokemon is much akin to rejecting a piece of who they are. But if nostalgia anchors Pokemon to memory, then the mere exposure effect cements it there. This effect claims that we become more fond of something when we are exposed to it repeatedly, even when we are not paying attention to it. Remakes, spin-offs, mobile tie-ins, and waves of merchandise follow the emergence of a new generation of games every few years. The cycles of social media, trading cards, and anime maintain continuous exposure in between releases. The brand never actually leaves the cultural landscape long enough to forget about it, so the consumer's emotional connection is strengthened by every interaction, even if it's just a passing glance. This process corrodes the distinction between what is an advertisement and what is a good memory. Because the exposure in between never stopped, a player can skip a generation and then go on to the next so that the brand remains a permanent fixture in their minds, and thus in their own identity, without ever having to engage with it directly. However, Pokemon's longevity depends on a bit of a paradox. It has to look like it changes continuously without ever outgrowing its youngest audience. A purposeful reduction of complexity to maximize comprehension has been the foundation of every successive generation. Nowadays, there is little risk, no moral ambiguity, and tutorials are long and forced. Although these characteristics are frequently defended as being user-friendly, when taken as a whole, they show a commitment to making the game specifically for children. Rivals don't pick what's weak to you, evil teams become less and less evil, and the battles themselves become more and more tame. Even beyond gameplay, the artistic direction has always been for children. The bright color scheme, rounded creature silhouettes, and non-threatening enemy design. Adults are then reassured that this world is still emotionally and morally stable for the same reasons that make Pokemon accessible to 6-year-olds. There's nothing too scary, too difficult, or too thought-provoking about Pokemon. This kid-friendliness is therefore a strategy for cross-generational retention. It guarantees that adults can return without difficulty and that new children can enter with ease. The point is that while the player's developmental context changes, the product really doesn't. By appealing to moral purity and social nostalgia, this infantilization of the brand serves as a form of immunity, shielding the franchise and making criticism lose its legitimacy when it infringes upon the sanctity of childhood. People say it's for kids, but that's evolved into a double-edged sword that can be used to deny criticism while claiming innocence. And children's media frequently uses this moral framing to defend subdued storytelling choices. Any departure from accepted norms runs the risk of being interpreted as corruption rather than innovation. Pokémon is therefore a large-scale example of this idea. Its designation as a children's series shields its formulaic repetition and resistance to thematic maturity from any form of scrutiny or criticism. This takes advantage of a basic imbalance in cultural power. While adult consumers feel like they have no right to criticize what seems innocent and for kids, children, on the other hand, the main audience, lack the capacity for any true critique, or at the very least, they won't be taken seriously like the adults will. For adults, critiquing Pokemon's commodification or stagnation runs the risk of coming across as joyless, elitist, or even cruel. Infantilization, then, acts not only as a shield but also turns laziness and a lack of creativity and quality into a form of a moral virtue. There is a tension between loyalty and perception for Pokemon fans who acknowledge the game's formulaic nature but still love it, as they justify the brand's simplicity as purposeful purity, rather than resolving this conflict by changing their assessment of it. The idea of "it's supposed to be simple" turns into a moral assertion rather than an artistic one. Pokemon also has an inherent advantage in the media due to its infantilized framing. Defenders are portrayed as compassionate and devoted, while critical voices are reframed as cynical or antagonistic. This reversal of critical norms, where critique is viewed as abnormal and positivity as moral, perpetuates the indulgent culture that has surrounded Pokemon. Indulgent culture? Well, you don't get to be a multi-billion-dollar company just selling games after all. You see, infantilization doesn't just preserve Pokemon's image, it preserves its market. While the franchise's public identity is with childhood, the way it makes its money is increasingly adult. Surveys from both the Pokemon Company and global toy and collectible markets consistently show that adults constitute a majority of merchandise purchasers, from trading cards to limited edition plushies. This is not an accident. It is the logical endpoint of infantilization as an economic model. This means that when we are exposed to Pokemon in our childhoods, that nostalgia is used against us as adults for us to fuel the machine that is this brand. Pokemon, therefore, becomes rather analogous to a gateway drug. The process is simple. Nostalgia is remonetized through goods that you never would have wanted or been able to afford as a child. When a 30-year-old buys a Pokemon plush, the act goes from nostalgic to a form of self-regulation. The infantilization of Pokemon turns material consumption into a behavior that preserves the identity that has been so intrinsically linked with the brand for so many years. Remember, engaging with Pokemon is a way of accessing your childhood, your nostalgia, your memories. This is evident in every type of Pokemon merchandise, including t-shirts, watches, and plush toys. Pokemon kitchen supplies aren't really made for kids, in my opinion. Studies have shown that nostalgia-based marketing increases purchase intention and brand attachment precisely because it evokes emotionally coherent, low-threat imagery. Every design and marketing choice made by Pokemon, from the bright color palettes and familiar melodies and the moral language of friendship, adventure, and discovery, signals safety, signals that part of you that remembers your childhood. The franchise positions consumption not as indulgence, but as a return to the childlike wonder we used to have about the world, the feeling of forming connections, going on adventures, discovering new things, either alone or with friends. Adults can engage in consumption that would otherwise read as childish precisely because the infantilized brand codes that behavior as wholesome. Buying Pokemon cards at age 30 is not immaturity in this case, it's a form of self-care, an emotional gesture towards the lost simplicity of one's childhood disguised as innocence by maintaining its image as for children. Criticism of Pokemon stagnation becomes not only undesirable, but it feels emotionally and morally wrong. It would require the consumer to question a symbol that informs their own sense of self, both past and present. Pokemon, therefore, sells reliability, not innovation. The brand's infantilization ensures that predictability is reinterpreted as comfort. The childlike aesthetic serves as a way to transform profits into caretaking and consumption into identity. The franchise keeps its consumers inside the world it built for them decades ago, and ensures that they never feel the need to leave. What looks like formulaic design is then, in effect, a retention mechanism. This design is just a gateway product, a system in which each product exists primarily to reintroduce the consumer to the brand's larger ecosystem. Pokémon games are not the end-all be-all. They are points through which players re-engage with the merchandise, anime, trading cards, and plushies that sustain the franchise's real revenue stream. It's a more nuanced and complex version of the marketing funnel. Generate awareness, interest, consideration, intent, evaluation, and then the purchase over and over again. The games generate the intellectual property that then cascades into the anime and card game, and those, in turn, fuel everything else. So how do you escape from this cycle? How can you get Pokemon to change their ways? How do you stop the critics from being manipulated? How do you stop nostalgia from affecting you and everyone else? How do you break away from the loop of growing up with it and then buying it as an adult? How can you get Pokemon to finally evolve? Well, let's think about this for a moment. Let's say you're able to get a boycott going. Let's say you're able to get a substantial, like the majority of Pokemon adult fans, to stop purchasing their products. It's unlikely to happen for one thing, but let's say you do succeed. All that the Pokemon Company, Nintendo, and Game Freak have to do is wait. People will either give in, or the next generation of Pokemon fans will go from children to adults, just perpetuating the cycle. You could just save yourself, but that'd mean nothing changes and you lose something that you genuinely love. Or you just don't even bother, just sip the Kool-Aid, accept the games will never be perfect, and give up. Yeah, not really a good way out of this one. You know, I haven't actually played Legend ZA yet, which is why I avoided directly passing judgment on it throughout this video and just talking about what others have said about it. However, looking at it makes me feel so happy and so sad. I love how they're doing the battling system. It's all I've ever wanted. And I've heard that the story is pretty good too, but seeing how poor the visuals are is so disheartening. Will I play it? Probably one day, just so I can form a full opinion on it, but man, I'm tired. I'm so tired. What do you think of Legend ZA? Let me know. And thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and thank you so much to my channel members. You rock. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.